this video, hopefully you've already seen my previous video on how natural selection is a tautology. In that video, I argued that evidence for natural selection was insufficient to demonstrate the validity of Darwinism. In this video, I want to address some of the specific reasons that I reject Darwinism itself. Let me start with the two-faced nature of scientists when it comes to evolution. We are told that science is all about the facts and that it's not a cult of personality. The strength of science is that ingrained beliefs can be challenged. Everyone, from the lowliest grad student on up, can question anything. Science stands ready and willing to demonstrate with evidence and reasoning why it holds to the theories that it holds. Consider what Henry Gee, a British paleontologist, wrote when he first began to conduct research. My summer work in the fossil fish section often forced me, a complete beginner, to make decisions about taxonomy. I had to reclassify specimens of pteracid fish, renaming them according to my reading of Alan Blick's thesis. I had to write out new labels and shuffle the entries that each fossil had in the museum card index. On one occasion, I had a crisis of confidence. What right had I, a novice who had done no serious work on fossils, to rearrange the national collection? I took my worries to Peter Foray. Don't worry about it, he counseled. Taxonomy is only a matter of opinion. The implication was that my opinion counted. It was as valid as the opinion of qualified scientists such as Patterson, Rosen, Gardner, or Fourier. And Gee is merely following in the footsteps of someone like Carl Sagan here, who wrote in The Demon-Haunted World, one of the great commandments of science is mistrust arguments from authority. Scientists, being primates and thus given to dominance hierarchies, of course do not always follow this commandment. Too many such arguments have proved too painfully wrong. Authorities must prove their contentions like everybody else. This independence of science, its occasional unwillingness to accept conventional wisdom, makes it dangerous to doctrines less self-critical or with pretensions to certitude. And yet, as soon as it comes to questioning Darwinists, all of this gets thrown out the window. Ernst Mayr, in What Evolution Is, said, "There is no longer any need to present an exhaustive list of the proofs for evolution. That evolution has taken place is so well established that such a detailed presentation of the evidence is no longer needed. In any case, it would not convince those who do not want to be persuaded." Well, it probably wouldn't convince those who do not want to be persuaded, but why would that be a reason to not present evidence? Frankly, that fits in with what Michael Crichton, in his speech to Caltech in 2003, criticized when he said, historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It is a way to avoid debate by claiming the matter is already settled. Put it this way. I've heard Darwinists say that Darwinism is just as established as Einstein's theory of relativity. But I've never heard a physicist ever say that Einstein's theory of relativity was just as established as Darwinism. Could be a reason this is a one-way street. In any case, you might have spotted one of the problems in Ernst Mayr's quote. He says that evolution has taken place is so well established. Suppose evolution has been established beyond all doubt, though. That does not mean Darwinism has. Darwinists take the lesser evidence that demonstrates evolution and treats it as if that proves their entire theory correct. That appears to me like a prosecutor in a trial saying, "Your Honor, we have proven that the defendant is guilty of murder beyond all reasonable doubt because we have established that he has jaywalked repeatedly." So let us dig into this a little. What is Darwinism specifically? As Mark Ridley in his textbook on evolution wrote, Darwin defined evolution as descent with modification. Darwin was inspired by Malthus's essay on population. What Malthus argued was essentially that organisms would have as many offspring as they could. However, resources were finite. This meant that inevitably organisms would have to compete with one another over those limited resources, with the loser dying. As Darwin wrote, "It at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of a new species." In Darwin's view, there would be a gradual change as species adapted to environmental changes. The environment would change slowly and species would adapt slowly to that. There would be a split and eventually over a long period of time, different species would result. Thus, Darwinism advocates gradualism. Each step in the lineage of species is smooth, slowly morphing to the next step over the course of uncountable years. For now, let us look at the other important aspect of Darwinism, which is that it is non-teleological. Now that's a complicated word, but essentially means that there cannot be a goal in mind for natural selection to aim for. In other words, when natural selection happens, when these mutations happen in generations, it's not for a purpose. There's no plan, there's no goal, there's no intent to do anything. So evolution that happens, it's non-directed. That's not to say it's random, because Darwinists in particular are very precise that what they are looking at is not random, but it is not directed. Now, we can get into some quibbles over what that means, but let's just explain this a little bit. Ernst Mayr points this out when he says, another widespread erroneous view of natural selection must also be refuted. Selection is not teleological, goal-directed. Indeed, how could an elimination process be teleological? Selection does not have a long-term goal. It is a process repeated anew in every generation. The only problem is that Darwinists can't stop using teleological language when they're describing their views. Sometimes it's subtle. For instance, this very same Mayr writes that skeletonization occurred in the early Cambrian because, quote, there may have been an evolution of efficient predators requiring protection by an exoskeleton. Requiring protection? That sounds like he's identified a goal that natural selection is driving towards. But don't worry, he doesn't just stop at being subtle. He outright says the entire evolution of these two large groups of organisms has since been affected by this choice among their remote ancestors. As if the organisms literally decided this is how we're going to evolve. For that matter, Stephen Jay Gould goes so far as to invoke the figure of the great token stringer to explain the Cambrian explosion and subsequent evolution. To make a new Burgess creature, the great token stringer takes one token at random from each compartment and strings them all together. Voila, the creature works, and you have nearly as many successful experiments as a musical scale can build catchy tunes. Today, the great token stringer uses a variety of separate bags, labeled vertebrate body plan, angiosperm body plan, molluscan body plan, and so forth. The tokens in each compartment are far less numerous, and few, if any, from bag 1 can also be found in bag 2. The great token stringer now makes a much more orderly set of new creatures, but the playfulness and surprise of his early work have disappeared. Now look, I know that Gould was being metaphorical and anthropomorphical here. But seriously, how can Darwinists blame the public for thinking that Darwinism is teleological when these are the examples given to explain it? Not only that, but how can Darwinists fault the public for thinking evolution is teleological when it clearly is teleological? Just take the eye for an example. Land and Nielsen say that complex eyes have evolved independently some 50 to 100 times. The independently is key here, because that means the eye formed on a branch in the evolutionary tree that did not already have eyes further up. And it did it not just once or twice, but 50 to 100 times that we know of so far. It's almost as if there's something in nature saying, we need eyes. Let's go towards eyes. And natural selection is driving towards that goal, like it's an endpoint. Clearly, the idea that the eye looks designed has been around for a long time. William Paley used it in his famous watch argument, where he said that if you found a watch on a beach, you would look at it and say, this is so well designed, it could not have possibly happened by chance. Therefore, there must have been a designer. And in fact, Richard Dawkins wrote The Blind Watchmaker as an attempt to refute Paley's argument. But the claim I'm making here is different from the one that Paley made. Paley and Dawkins were both addressing why an eye looks to be designed as an eye. What I'm pointing out is that evolution seems to be saying we need eyes, and we're going to go towards eyes. It's almost like evolution is biased. It has a goal in mind. If it was just the eye, then perhaps it would be a fluke, a one-off, some random weird event. Or maybe DNA somehow is structured in such a way that the laws of physics and chemistry react in a manner that results in tissues that tend towards becoming eyes. But it's not just eyes. Look at this picture. This is a mouse. And here's another picture of a different mouse. Now, they're obviously different. You can tell that there are some physical differences between them, but clearly they're both mice. But what's the main structural difference between them? Well, you can't really see it from here, but this mouse is a marsupial mouse, and this mouse is a placental mouse. Now, placental births are ones where the embryo grows entirely inside the placenta, up until the point of birth, when the developed organism comes out. In marsupials, however, the fetus is delivered prematurely, and then it typically makes its way to a pouch in the mother's skin where it finally finishes development. Clearly, those two processes are radically different, yet morphologically, that is how they look, they're nearly identical. I mean, you can spot the differences, don't get me wrong, I don't want to overplay that. But that's clearly a mouse, not a bird. It's not a mongoose. It's a mouse of some type. Surely this can be explained by Darwinism, though, right? I mean, at some point in their history, there was a common ancestor. One of the offspring was marsupial, one wasn't. That's the typical explanation that we would hear. Okay, but what about this then? One of these is a flying squirrel and one of them is a sugar glider. Can you tell which one is which? Either the split between placental and marsupial pregnancies happened before the squirrel and mouse were developed, and that common ancestor somehow evolved into both squirrels and mice that look similar both in Europe and in Australia, Or the split between marsupial and placental animals somehow happened twice, once in mice and once in squirrels. Except it's not just twice. There are really about 30 such species that we know of so far. Marsupial moles look like placental moles, the wombat looks like a groundhog, bandicoots resemble rabbits, the Tasmanian wolf looks like the placental wolf, and so on. Furthermore, nearly all marsupials are found in Australia. Given the marsupials are in one location, it seems far more likely that the split between marsupial and placental births happened once, before wolves, squirrels, and mice evolved, than that there's something magical in Australia that keeps changing mammals into marsupials. So the prevailing theory is that when Australia split off from Gondwana, some descendant of a shrew-like creature that was the first mammal became a marsupial in Australia, while those in Europe continue being placental, and then the placental shrew in Australia went extinct, leaving just marsupials there. But that still leaves the question, why does the Tasmanian wolf look so much like a European wolf? Why did the shrew evolve into wolves, squirrels, groundhogs, and the like in both places? Darwinists claim that this is due to convergent evolution, that similar environmental pressures were enacted on the animals in such a way that they evolved along similar paths. That sounds nice, but does it stand up to scrutiny? Are the environments of Europe and Australia so similar that they would make equal shrew-like creatures become wolves and rabbits and groundhogs and mice in both locations, while there's clearly enough difference that being a marsupial in Australia provided a huge survivability advantage because the marsupials survived there? Convergent evolution might explain one or two of these, but when wolves exist in both Europe and Australia, it's almost like nature wants there to be a wolf-like animal in both places. When eyes independently evolve 50 to 100 times, isn't it more reasonable to believe that there's something driving evolution towards that as an end goal than that environmental pressures force it to evolve that many times out of nothing? And the thing is, Darwin himself knew this. Although he didn't understand the significance, Stephen Jay Gould, in his massive book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, summarizes Darwin's case against creationism. One of Darwin's points was that when you introduced species from the mainland onto the islands, they were nearly universally better equipped to take over the island. Darwin thus argued, if God created species for islands, why would the species designed for continents so often be superior in competition? Furthermore, in Gould's summary, he says, on these islands, endemic members of other groups often assume the ecological roles almost always occupied by more appropriate or more competitive taxa in the richer faunas of continents. For example, reptiles on the Galapagos or wingless birds on New Zealand acting as surrogates for mammals. Gould quotes Darwin saying, for instance, in certain islands not tenanted by mammals, some of the endemic plants have beautifully hooked seeds, yet few relations are more striking than the adaptation of hooked seeds for transportal by the wool and fur of quadrupeds. Continuing further in Gould's summary, peculiar morphological consequences often ensue when creature sees places usually inhabited by other forms that could not reach an island. Many plants herbaceous inhabit on continents become arbораceous on islands otherwise devoid of trees. Now, in terms of arguments against the prevailing views of creationism of the day, those points may work, but they're really inexplicable in Darwinism. Darwin saw plants that were normally herbs when they grew on the mainland suddenly look like trees on islands that lack trees. But why would the plant do that? It doesn't grow that way on the mainland. And think of how peculiar it is that there would be mammalian surrogates, flightless birds and reptiles, acting as if they're mammals. Why would they do this unless nature wants mammals? If an island is missing trees or mammals, then nature is going to force the closest possible surrogate to take that role. Put it this way, the only reason birds and reptiles would act like mammals in an environment when there are no mammals is if everything about nature is saying we need mammals. The only reason a plant would grow like a tree is if everything in nature is saying we need a tree-shaped thing. Clearly these organisms are not the most ideal animals to do this though. They're not trees and they're not mammals. They're still birds and reptiles and they're still herbaceous plants, which is why when you introduce the normal animals from the mainland, those mainland species run rampant and just roll over the existing island species. If every environment is pushing towards the existence of mammals, that means that mammals are inevitable. They must evolve. It's not random mutations being selected that drive towards mammals. Clearly that is teleological in origin, not random mutations that just happen to evolve. And thus, for that reason, it does not fit modern views of Darwinism.